The White House saying Barack Obama has told his Afghan counterpart if Hamid Karzai doesn't sign on to a long-delayed bilateral security agreement, then all U.S. troops will be gone for good by the end of this year. More from Shirley Sitbon.
U.S. officials have planned out several options for U.S. troops in Afghanistan when most soldiers leave at the end of the year. A few thousand could stay behind to help the Afghan army fight Taliban insurgents. Or all U.S. forces could pull out, leaving Afghan soldiers on their own. Washington would rather keep troops on the ground, but only if Afghanistan signs the bilateral security agreement. According to the deal, if American troops stay in Afghanistan, local courts would not prosecute them. The deal says that U.S. troops could lead anti-terrorist raids in Afghan homes once they've informed Afghan authorities. Since November, President Obama has waited on Afghan President Hamid Karzai to sign, but he hasn't. The U.S. now hopes that his successor might.
We're not going to leave this in the hands of President Karzai to sign, and that there is the option of having a successor sign. In addition, in terms of consequences, what we have indicated is that the later it goes, the harder it is, but also to plan, and also the smaller it will be.
Several candidates to the presidential elections in Afghanistan in April said they'd sign the deal, but waiting for the elections and the new government will take several months. Washington says it has planned out the withdrawal of all troops in case the agreement falls through. The zero option is picking up.
It's all coming at a crucial moment for U.S. defense policy. Let's go to Washington and Mark Jacobson of the Truman National Security Project. Mark, a former top diplomat with the NATO forces in Afghanistan. Mark, the chair, thank you for being with us. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Afghanistan has been telling the Associated Press news agency that the uncertainty of a continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan may encourage Afghan security forces in some parts of the country to, quote, hedge their bets. Is Martin Dempsey second-guessing the president?
Thank you for having me. I don't think Chairman Dempsey is second-guessing the president at all. What Chairman Dempsey is doing is reinforcing the president's message that a decision by Karzai's government not to sign the BSA at this time is putting Afghanistan's security in jeopardy. There is no doubt that those who are uncertain about a U.S. commitment, a NATO commitment in the future, are worried about this zero option. And there is equally no doubt that the Taliban will play off of this announcement. But make no mistake, this is the refusal to sign the BSA that's put us all in this situation.
Dempsey saying in that same interview that effectively Washington has until the summer to make a final decision. If that's the case, and seeing that there are elections scheduled for the spring, why bring this to a head now?
Right. Look, I agree with that logic as well. The challenge is that we've been in a game of chicken for the last several months. Karzai refuses to sign. Washington saying, well, if you don't sign, there are going to be no troops. And of course, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen saying, there won't be any NATO troops, there won't be any funding. You have to make it clear to the candidates and to Karzai that there needs to be a reinvigorated effort at getting a signature on the BSA, or that there are going to be consequences. Nations cannot stay indefinitely if they do not know that the Americans will be there after 2014.
And if you're a betting man, Mark Jacobson, would you say that Karzai won't be the one who will be signing?
I'm almost positive that Karzai won't sign, and this is what concerns me, because I think that our NATO allies are going to have to accelerate their own withdrawal timelines if there's a chance that there are no troops in Afghanistan on the 1st of January 2015.
Do you think that other candidates would follow his example and would refuse to sign?
I actually think the candidates have been very open, all of them from what I can see, in saying they would sign. The problem is, and this gets to your question, there's no guarantee there. For political reasons, the candidates may actually have to be a little bit anti-American when they take office in order to consolidate their ability to govern.
So you've met Hamid Karzai, you've seen him up close. Why is he taking part in this game of chicken at this point, since he's not running?
I think Karzai is trying to establish his legacy, and he does not want his legacy to be, I served the American presidents. He wants his legacy to be, I served the Afghan people, all of the Afghan people. Likewise, I think there's a strategic calculation on Karzai's part that hardball on the BSA will give him more leverage when it comes to reconciliation talks with the Taliban.
At this point in time, then, Mark, how precarious is the chance of a continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan beyond December 31st of this year?
I think we are at the most dangerous point since the summer of 2009, where it wasn't just an Allied presence that was in doubt, but the entire war. The difference is that the U.S. Congress and the American people have much less patience for a continued deployment to Afghanistan than they did 5 years ago. And I think this is what could create a situation, a fait accompli, if you will, where the zero option becomes the new norm, or the zero option becomes a reality at the end of the year.
Now, let me ask you, over the border in Pakistan, the past week, we've been seeing attacks by the army against positions of the Taliban in the tribal areas. The government in Islamabad summoning the Taliban to get serious about talks. What's your interpretation of what's going on in Pakistan right now?
Well, this has been a running battle between the United States, Afghanistan, and Pakistan the last several years. I'm encouraged by the fact that the Pakistanis have taken the offensive again against targets that they feel are a serious threat to their own existence. What we really need from Pakistan, however, is a concerted effort to cut off the supply lines to the Afghan Taliban, the Quetta Taliban, and also the Haqqani network, which is still operating with relative impunity in Afghanistan, precisely because their sanctuaries are across the border. Until we see that, there really won't be any major change to Pakistani policy on the insurgency in Afghanistan.
And why are we seeing these strikes now?
I think unrelenting pressure, not only by the United States government, but also I think an increased understanding by some Pakistani generals that the threat to Islamabad does not come only from the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, but that if there's a victory in Afghanistan by the Afghan Taliban, this creates as much of a threat for Pakistan, even more of a threat for Pakistan on its western border.
You were mentioning earlier, Mark, how in the U.S. public opinion doesn't have the stomach for long, protracted involvement in foreign conflicts. How's the news going down where you are that the Defense Secretary announcing on Tuesday that the United States would be reducing the size of its military to its smallest since World War II?
Right. Well, there are a couple things. I don't think the size of the U.S. Army alone really determines the degree to which the United States can protect itself, but it does reflect a desire that long-term occupations will not be done without a very high political threshold to cross. In other words, you're going to have to call it the National Guard and the reserves. There's going to have to be a national consensus. But I wouldn't make the mistake of thinking that we don't see a world where this is a threat. Clearly, if you look at Africa, if you look at the Middle East, these types of complex contingencies are still the norm. But I think it certainly reflects that desire that we don't just jump into another Afghanistan or Iraq situation again.
And how's the news going down where you are?
Well, I think as expected, you're seeing people taking hits at particular aspects of Hagel's proposed budget. The president's proposed budget. People are attacking decisions to cut ships, on where basing will or won't be cut. But I think overall, there's agreement that we live in a more uncertain world. Where you'll see disagreement is over which particular platforms, which ships, which tanks, which aircraft are needed to protect against that threat. And that is the classic Washington debate, because in the end, it will have to do with jobs in particular congressional districts. And that's what's so disappointing, that we can't get beyond that.
All right, Mark Jacobson of the Truman National Security Project. Many thanks for joining us from Washington. Stay with us. Much more to come here on France 24. We're going to have more news for you at the bottom of the hour. And then all the day's business with Marcus Carlson, the latest on Credit Suisse being forced to answer up to charges of mass tax evasion on the part of some of its clients. Stay with us.